Sister-in-law blamed my disabled child for ruining her wedding photos and demanded I pay for Photoshop, but my brother overheard everything, and now, just 2 weeks ago, my younger brother, David, married the love of his life, Amelia, in what was a beautiful and heartwarming ceremony. David had been looking forward to this day for a long time, and everyone who knew him could see just how deeply he loved Amelia. Originally, their wedding was planned to be a completely child-free event, and this was clearly stated in their invitation cards. However, a couple of weeks before the wedding, I received a phone call from David. To my surprise, he told me that he wanted to make an exception for his niece, my daughter Katie. I was taken aback and asked him if he was sure. David told me how much he loves Katie and how he couldn't go through with the wedding without having her as their flower girl. I was almost in tears hearing him say that. Katie absolutely adores her Uncle David, and they have always had a special bond. David assured me that he had talked with his bride and she had no issues with it either. I could hear the sincerity in his voice. He didn't want Katie to miss such an important day in his life, and he knew how much it would mean to her. For some context, my daughter Katie was born with partial paralysis. She can't move her body below her arms, which has obviously been a life-altering reality for us. As a parent, when me and my husband, Roger, first found out, it was truly devastating. It felt like the ground had been pulled out from under us. We were in complete shock, refusing to accept the diagnosis. We went from doctor to doctor, 4 in total, desperately seeking a different opinion, hoping that maybe someone, somewhere, had a solution. We did every test imaginable, and with each one, we prayed for good news. We wanted to believe that there might be a surgery or a treatment out there that could change things for Katie, could give her the life she deserved. But no matter where we went or what we did, the answer was always the same. There was nothing that could be done. Coming to terms with the fact that our daughter's condition was very, very hard. It was a dark time for us, filled with sleepless nights, tears, and questions that had no answers. We felt completely helpless looking at our precious daughter. Our hearts broke every time we thought about what Katie's future might look like. That feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. But over time, slowly and slowly, we began to find and connect with other families who were on the same journey as us and felt a bit reassured. Instead of thinking about what Katie couldn't do, we started focusing on what she could do, and on giving her as much love and support as humanly possible. One of the people who has been a constant source of joy and light for Katie is her Uncle David. He never once treated her differently because of her condition. In fact, he has a way of making my daughter feel so comfortable, so completely at ease, that when they're together, it's like her condition doesn't even exist. This is something that I've always appreciated, especially because other family members, sometimes even unintentionally, can make things awkward or uncomfortable. For example, my own mother, when she first saw Katie after she was born and realized the extent of her paralysis, was visibly shaken. I understood that it was a difficult thing for her to process, but her reaction caught me off guard. Instead of offering comfort or support, she pulled me aside and, in a hushed voice, suggested that I should try to have another baby, one who could walk. My eyes widened in shock upon hearing her words. My mother continued to urge me that maybe if I tried again, I would have a better baby. It was as if Katie wasn't enough or didn't count because of her condition. I was stunned. It was such a heartless thing to say. But David stood up for me immediately, scolding our mother for being so harsh and insensitive. He told her that Katie was perfect the way she was and that she didn't need to be replaced or compared to anyone else. I'll never forget the fierceness in his voice when he defended my child. He scolded our mother for pushing me to get pregnant when I was still in the process of grieving and coming to terms with the fact of Katie's condition. Ever since then, I have not allowed my mother to spend any alone time with Katie and have reduced my contact with her as much as possible. Meanwhile, David would come over every weekend, rain or shine, just to spend time with my daughter. They'd spend hours goofing around, watching silly shows, or playing games. It was during those weekends that I would see Katie light up, for a few hours, in a way that was so pure and joyful. She could just be a kid having fun with her favorite person in the world. Their bond has been a blessing for her and for us as well. So when he called me about making an exception for my daughter to attend his wedding, I was deeply touched. I knew that allowing Katie to be there would mean everything to her, and it would also be a beautiful way for David to honor their connection on his special day. So, I agreed to bring along Katie and was excited for her to be a flower girl. However, as much as David was eager to have Katie at the wedding, I don't think his bride, Amelia, was quite as enthusiastic about the idea. A few days after David called me with the invitation for Katie, Amelia reached out to me directly. She informed me that she had certain conditions for allowing Katie to attend their wedding. The conditions were oddly specific and rubbed me the wrong way. First, she insisted that Katie wear a beige dress, one that was flowy and, in her words, appropriate for the wedding atmosphere. Amelia also mentioned that Katie's hair needed to be done in a way that didn't look unkempt or ruin the aesthetic of her wedding. I was taken aback by how controlling her requests were. However, I chose to bite my tongue. After all, it was her wedding, and we needed to abide by her wedding theme. I didn't want to stir up any tension or make things uncomfortable for David. So, I nodded along and assured her that I would comply with her wishes. After all, what mattered most to me was that Katie could be there for her uncle. I immediately went out and bought a beautiful beige dress for Katie. It was simple but elegant, just the way Amelia wanted me to buy, and I knew it would make my daughter feel special. I took a photo of the dress and sent it to Amelia since she had wanted me to send a picture of the dress after my purchase. I hoped she would be satisfied, but to my surprise, she wasn't. Amelia replied back quickly, saying that the dress was too beige and looked lifeless. She said that she preferred something with a little more color. I felt confused and frustrated. Wasn't this exactly what she had asked for? Still, I didn't want to argue or push back. I was doing everything I could to keep the peace. So, instead of just buying another dress on my own and wasting my money this time, I decided to send her a few options before making a purchase. I didn't want to buy something that she would inevitably reject again. Amelia finally picked one of the dresses I had sent over, and I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw her choice. The beige color of the dress she selected was practically identical to the dress I had already bought, the one she had criticized for being too beige. The only difference was the tiniest hint of a pinkish tint that was barely noticeable. At that moment, it started to dawn on me that this wasn't about the dress or the color at all. Amelia was deliberately making things difficult. It felt like she was testing me or setting up obstacles to make me jump through hoops. There could be a reason she didn't want my daughter at the wedding, however, she had not told me directly anything and I did not want to unnecessarily stir up things with her. If she wanted to uninvite my daughter, she needed to talk to my brother and have it sorted out. However, she never did and the wedding happened as planned. On the day of my brother's wedding, Katie looked absolutely stunning as she made her way down the aisle in her beautiful beige dress, the one that Amelia had finally approved. The dress flowed gracefully as she wheeled herself forward, her face glowing with happiness. As she stopped to toss flower petals, the entire room seemed to pause. There was an audible gasp from the guests, followed by a chorus of compliments. People couldn't stop talking about how beautiful she looked, and I could see the joy radiating from her as she continued down the aisle, scattering flowers and resuming her steady progress in her wheelchair. I felt an overwhelming sense of pride and love for my daughter at that moment. Seeing her there, fully participating in such a special occasion, was a memory I'll treasure forever. Tears of joy welled up in my eyes, and I glanced over at David, whose expression mirrored my emotions. He looked at Katie with so much pride, his smile wide and warm, clearly touched by her presence and her radiant spirit. As she reached the front, David walked over to her, kneeling down to give her a heartfelt hug. It was such a tender moment between them, one that spoke volumes about their close bond. Then, he helped her position herself to the side, making sure she was comfortable and could be a part of the ceremony from the front row. A few moments later, Amelia began her walk down the aisle, and there's no denying that she looked breathtaking in her wedding gown. As she approached the altar, I couldn't help but notice how her gaze briefly landed on Katie. For a split second, I hoped to see her smile at my daughter, some acknowledgement of her presence and the role she played on this important day. But instead, Amelia visibly rolled her eyes and looked past Katie without even a hint of a smile. I couldn't help but feel a pang of disappointment. Still, I chose to push the thought aside, not wanting anything to overshadow the joy of the day. David and Amelia took their vows, and when the officiant declared them husband and wife, I felt a rush of happiness for my brother. He had finally found someone to share his life with, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. Seeing him so happy made my heart swell with pride and joy. After the ceremony, during the photo sessions, we gathered together as a family for pictures. David made sure that Katie was included in every shot. We took so many pictures, capturing the love and unity that we all felt that day. During the photo session, I couldn't help but notice that Amelia seemed a bit off. She kept sighing heavily and huffing under her breath, which I initially brushed off as her being tired. After all, weddings are exhausting, and maybe she just needed a break from taking so many photos. But as the session continued, her behavior became harder to ignore. At one point, when David picked Katie up and held her in his arms for a picture, Amelia's expression noticeably shifted. She looked disappointed, her smile faltering as her eyes focused on them. It was subtle but clear enough to make me uncomfortable. After we had taken several pictures with Katie, Amelia came up to me with a polite but clipped tone and asked if I could wheel Katie out so she could take some photos with just her family. The request caught me off guard, but I agreed. I took Katie to sit with my parents at the reception. My mother did acknowledge how beautiful my daughter looked and told me that I was lucky to have a daughter like her. It was a small gesture, but I was happy that my mother was moving past her biases and learning to accept my daughter for who she is. Overall, Katie, blissfully unaware of any tension, seemed to have had a good day, and that's what mattered most to me. After the wedding, Amelia and David left for their honeymoon, and from the pictures and stories David posted on his social media, it seemed like they were having an amazing time. I was happy for him. He deserved to enjoy this special time with his new wife. Once they returned from their honeymoon, David invited our family, me, Roger, and our parents, over to his new home for lunch. It was meant to be a casual family gathering, and I was looking forward to seeing him again, especially since we hadn't really spoken much after the wedding. Since the wedding, my mom and I have reconnected in a way I didn't expect. She had taken the time to properly apologize to me for what she had said about Katie years ago, and about pushing me to try for another baby. She was genuinely remorseful, and while part of me was still cautious, I appreciated the fact that she had recognized the pain her words had caused. During lunch, David was absolutely over the moon to see Katie again. The moment we arrived at his house, he excitedly pulled out a collection of gifts he had brought back for her from their honeymoon. He had clearly put a lot of thought into each one, and Katie's face lit up with pure joy as she unwrapped them. She was smiling from ear to ear, and David, as always, was completely engaged with her, asking about her favorite part of the wedding and telling her how much everyone had been talking about how beautifully she had performed her role. He told her over and over again how proud he was, mentioning how friends and family had called him after the wedding to compliment Katie on what a wonderful job she had done. Hearing all these compliments made Katie beam with pride, her eyes twinkling with happiness. However, while my brother was showering Katie with attention, I couldn't help but notice Amelia. I observed her closely, and it became glaringly obvious that she wasn't sharing in David's enthusiasm. She didn't smile or even acknowledge Katie. Instead, she looked visibly annoyed, as if David's interaction with Katie was somehow an inconvenience to her. Her expression carried a mix of exasperation and impatience, and she barely engaged with anyone while David focused on Katie. It was like she was waiting for the moment to pass, eager for his attention to shift away from my daughter. David, of course, was completely oblivious to his wife's attitude. After lunch, we all sat around the living room, relaxing and chatting as a family. It was then that Amelia came over to me and quietly asked if we could talk privately. I felt a knot form in my stomach because I already had a sense of what was coming. I had been bracing myself for this conversation ever since the wedding day. With a nod, I agreed, preparing myself for what I knew would be a difficult discussion. Amelia led me to one of the bedrooms, and we sat down to talk. She started by first complimenting me for doing a wonderful job with Katie by following all her conditions and keeping my word regarding Katie's appearance at the wedding. I nodded and thanked her, telling her that I wanted to be respectful because it was her big day. She paused, then added that while she appreciated my effort, there was something bothering her ever since the wedding. My heart sank. Amelia took out her phone and pulled up the wedding photos, scrolling through the ones the photographer had taken. I saw images of all of us smiling, enjoying the moment together as a family: David, Amelia, Katie, me, and the rest of the relatives. She stopped on one particular picture, and pointed at it, and her tone grew cold. "Look at this," she said, zooming in on the image. It was one of the family photos with Katie in her wheelchair beside David, all of us smiling and looking happy. Amelia's finger hovered over Katie, and she looked at me with a scornful expression. "Do you see how your stupid kid in a wheelchair is ruining the vibe of the entire picture?" she said, the words coming out sharp and venomous. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I was in complete shock. How could she say something so cruel, so heartless, about my daughter? I felt an immediate rush of anger. The very suggestion that my sweet girl, who had tried her best to be part of the celebration, was now being blamed for ruining the vibe. I argued back, telling Amelia she had no right to speak about Katie that way, and reminded her that she knew from the start that Katie was in a wheelchair. There was no other way for my daughter to pose for photos. How else could she have possibly participated? Amelia, unfazed by my reasoning, scoffed and said, "That's not my problem," and went on to say that seeing Katie's wheelchair in every photo was an eyesore that had ruined her vision for the wedding pictures. As if that wasn't enough, she then suggested that I should offer compensation for letting my daughter ruin her wedding. I was appalled by her audacity. I raised my voice, asking her what kind of compensation she was even talking about, completely shocked that she would make such a ridiculous demand. That's when Amelia hit me with her real demand. She said that I needed to pay for a photo editor to Photoshop Katie either out of the wedding pictures or, at the very least, make her appear without the wheelchair. I gasped in disbelief. How could she possibly think it was acceptable to erase my daughter from the wedding photos or to alter who she was just for the sake of aesthetics? This was the breaking point. I couldn't hold back any longer. "Are you serious?" I shouted, my words filled with disbelief. "You want me to pay someone to erase my daughter, or pretend she isn't in a wheelchair? You're an ableist, Amelia. I am proud of my daughter exactly the way she is, and I will not be paying for any kind of Photoshop. If you had such a problem with her being part of the wedding, then you should have never let her be the flower girl in the first place." Amelia argued back, saying she had tried her best to dissuade David from letting Katie be their flower girl, but that his love for Katie was so blind that he did not agree. She told me how she knew if she had insisted on uninviting my daughter, he would have broken off the wedding also. I shook my head as I realized that this woman had been harboring such resentment toward Katie. Her reasoning was so callous, so heartless, that it made me feel disgusted. I reminded her sharply that my daughter was a living, breathing human being with real emotions and did not deserve to be hated this way. She loved her uncle and had been genuinely overjoyed to be part of their wedding. She didn't deserve this kind of treatment, especially not from Amelia, now that she was my SIL. But Amelia didn't seem to care. She argued back, saying that both Katie and I were just attention seekers, and that I shouldn't forget the only reason people had paid so much attention to Katie at the wedding was because of her disability. Her words were so vile that something inside me snapped. The rage that had been building finally boiled over, and before I even realized what I was doing, I slapped Amelia. The sound of my hand connecting with her face echoed in the stillness of the room, and I stood there, my hand trembling, my chest heaving with the weight of everything that had just happened. Amelia's face flushed red with shock, and I could see her eyes widen in disbelief. Before she could react, my brother barged into the room, along with my husband and my parents. My brother asked Amelia if she really meant what she had said about Katie. Amelia's eyes widened in realization. It turns out that David had been listening to our entire conversation and had likely heard every single word of her cruel and manipulative remarks. Panic flashed across her face, and she tried to backtrack, stumbling over her words in a desperate attempt to explain herself. But it was too late. David's voice filled the room as he bellowed at her, and called her shameless and manipulative for bringing me aside to talk about my daughter this way. "I can't believe you manipulated me into thinking you were a nice person when, in reality, you hate my family this much," he shouted, his voice filled with both pain and anger. The disappointment in his tone was palpable, and it was clear that he was seeing Amelia for who she really was, someone who had hidden her true feelings all along. Amelia, desperate to salvage the situation, tried to argue back. "I don't hate your family exactly, this is just about Katie," she said, her voice trembling. She then tried to spin the situation around, accusing David of always favoring Katie over everyone just because she was disabled and he felt sorry for her. She claimed that as his wife, she deserved more of his attention and that he needed to stop prioritizing Katie so much and focus on their marriage instead. Then, Amelia began to complain about how inviting Katie had led to some of her friends mock her wedding pictures later, leaving her feeling humiliated. She claimed that this was the reason she had wanted to Photoshop Katie out of the photos so that she could always remember their beautiful day without such ugliness. Thankfully, David wasn't having it. He told her to get off her high horse and stop acting like his niece could have somehow spoiled their pictures and that her being in the pictures made them even more beautiful. "I love Katie like my own daughter. Giving attention to her doesn't take away anything from you. The fact that I even have to explain this goes on to show how cheap your mentality is. Katie is part of my family, and if you hate her this much, then I can't be married to you." Amelia's face went pale as David's words hit her. He looked at her with a clarity that showed he wasn't willing to let this slide. "You're an ableist, just like my sister said," he added, echoing the very accusation I had made earlier. "The fact that you continue to justify your behavior means that you will never change. I do not want to be married to a cruel woman like you. Pack up your things and go back to your parents' place." Amelia, still in shock, tried to argue once more, but my mother, who had been quiet up until now, finally stepped in, visibly livid. She expressed her anger about the situation, emphasizing that while it was one thing to dislike the attention Katie received at the wedding, considering photoshopping her out of the pictures was heartless. My mother firmly stated her support for David's decision and told Amelia that she should be ashamed of herself for even suggesting such a thing. Hearing my mother's defense and seeing David's unwavering stance, Amelia knew she had no more ground to stand on. My husband looked pissed, and I am sure if Amelia was not my brother's wife at the time, he would have thrashed right then and there for speaking such vile things about our daughter. Amelia was outnumbered and her true colors had been laid bare for everyone to see. Reluctantly, with no other choice, she walked out of the house with just her phone and car keys. Later, David apologized to me and Roger for what his wife had said about our daughter, but I appreciated him for standing up for Katie. This was in no way his fault. That evening, Amelia's parents called David and my parents, wanting to discuss further about the situation, likely after Amelia had gone to them in tears. However, David has requested them for some time off so he can cool down and think about things. Since the incident, Amelia has been sending me several messages where she is basically blaming me for causing issues between her and David. She thinks I could have simply solved their issues by agreeing to pay for a photo editor. Now, of course, I don't want my brother's marriage to break down because of me, but at the same time, what Amelia has said to me about my daughter is unforgivable. Am I the a-hole for Amelia being kicked out of the house? Update 1. I am receiving so many comments and DMs that I am unable to reply to everyone. Hence, I will clarify all the points here. Amelia had met Katie before and knew about her relationship with my brother, yet it seemed she had managed to conceal her disdain for my daughter all this time. Not even once had I ever suspected that she had actually hated my daughter this much. I understand that some people might feel uncomfortable seeing a child in a wheelchair, especially at a wedding, but we do our best to make Katie feel as normal as possible so she doesn't feel like she is being treated differently just because of her disability. Katie is a beautiful person, and regardless of her being in a wheelchair, I'm confident that people would still compliment her. She has blue eyes and her dad's blonde hair. It's clear that Amelia was simply trying to find faults in my daughter out of her own jealousy. My brother is the godfather of Katie. This is because, I am confident that if anything happens to me and my husband, he will be there for my daughter. He loves Katie like his own daughter, which is why he is so fiercely protective of her. Hearing Amelia's words and seeing her true intentions about my daughter must have felt like a complete betrayal to him. I don't think Katie heard anything that Amelia and I spoke, as she was busy watching her cartoons. If she had, she would have definitely asked me some questions later. Update 2. For everyone asking, my brother is getting his wedding annulled. My brother and his lawyer strongly believe that Katie misrepresented herself from the start and manipulated him into thinking she would be okay with his family when in truth she wasn't. When Amelia discovered that David was genuinely serious about leaving her, she panicked and made a desperate attempt to save her marriage. In a half-hearted effort, she reached out to me to offer an apology. But it was pretty clear to me that her words were insincere. She wasn't genuinely remorseful or ready to take responsibility for her actions. I simply couldn't accept her apology, knowing it was just a ploy to shift the blame away from herself. This only fueled her anger. In her frustration, she immediately turned on me, accusing me of ruining my brother's life. It was as if I was the source of all her problems, rather than the consequences of her own choices. She told me how I was at fault for forcing my brother to leave her when he could have been so happy with her instead. As if this wasn't enough, Amelia's parents also reached out to my parents, attempting to shift the blame onto me and Katie for what their daughter is experiencing. Thankfully, my parents have pushed back against this unfair accusation. My dad, in particular, expressed his disappointment, telling them they should be ashamed of the daughter they raised and that he is relieved she will no longer be part of our family. I'm so proud that my family has stood up for me and Kate throughout all this. I did speak to my brother and expressed my apologies for what he was going through with Amelia. He reassured me that it was better for him to learn the truth about her now rather than later when she could have potentially done or said something more damaging in front of Katie. I completely agree, and feel a sense of relief knowing that we are effectively getting rid of Amelia from our lives soon. Update 3. It's been 4 months since my last update. For everyone asking, my brother has officially annulled his marriage and is no longer married to Amelia. After the truth about their marriage falling apart became public, Amelia faced a lot of backlash from everyone. She eventually reached out to me to apologize, but I simply blocked her without responding. Recently, all of us went on a vacation together. It was a wonderful time for all of us. David and Katie continue to have an amazing relationship, which brings me a lot of joy. The whole experience has only strengthened our family bonds, and I'm grateful for that.